Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. If anyone is in doubt why the National MP for Coromandel has been rolled by a person who was chair of the Epsom LEC, they no longer are, Mr Speaker. That is the reason why someone who was chair of the Epsom National Party is now standing in the Coromandel. The National Party said, we have got to have quality candidates, because we've got no quality candidates. But what we've got to do is we've got to get rid of that candidate in Coromandel, because she is doing us an immeasurable amount of harm. She stands up here, Mr Speaker, she stands up here and she tries to tell ordinary New Zealanders that the price of food has dropped. She tries to tell them that the price of food has dropped. Now that is someone, Mr Speaker, who is so out of touch with reality. That is someone, Mr Speaker, who has not spoken to the people in her electorate about how they are coping in this day and age. Mr Speaker, the average wage in New Zealand is $50,000. 75% of New Zealanders earn below the average wage. 75% of New Zealanders earn below $50,000. And these are people who are really struggling. I'm not talking, Mr Speaker, I'm not talking about those 650 people who earn over $1 million, who got a tax cut of $1,000 a week. What I'm talking about is the people in Napier on the median wage who got about $5 a week in their hand and who have seen the price of petrol go through the roof, who've seen the price of milk go through the roof, who've seen the price of food go through the roof, to the point where something has to give. And it tends to be things like milk. Now, Mr Speaker, there are only 3 points I want to make with regard to this bill. The first one is that Fonterra is of vital importance to the New Zealand economy. If we allow the sale of New Zealand assets to overseas interests, then New Zealanders will become tenants in their own land. The second point I will make is that this bill is simply an interim measure until more can be done. And more does need to be done. We all admit that. The third point, Mr Speaker, is if I look at the stats, I think the dairy industry is an industry that appears to be under threat, that appears to be in trouble. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. The first point, Mr Speaker, about this being of vital importance, around 74% of New Zealand's export earnings at the moment are from the primary sector. We're not just talking about dairying, we're talking about forestry, agriculture, horticulture, but dairying is a large component of that. This is a very important part of our economy. Let's face facts here. We are an agricultural-based economy, a primary production-based economy. That is why this is such an important part of our economy. But it is also, Mr Speaker, why I have grave concerns about what is happening to the ownership patterns of New Zealand's agricultural sector. And I want to give you a classic example, one that's been in the news a lot, and this is the Crayford Farms. I do not know why, I cannot find one good reason why Landcorp doesn't buy these farms, hold them in some sort of trust, and then use them as training farms for young New Zealanders who want to get on the land, who want to learn about dairying. This would keep it in New Zealand ownership. This would allow our young people to learn how to become great dairy farmers. It wouldn't allow a Chinese company to tie up that whole supply chain from New Zealand farm right through to Chinese market. Mr Speaker, New Zealanders want to control that supply chain. We want to be in control of the land ownership. This is our country, and I firmly believe that it should remain in New Zealand control. New Zealanders do not want to become tenants in our own land. New Zealanders don't want to become a nation that has sold its land, sold its assets, sold its competitive advantage to these large companies so we can be milked. Other countries appear to be a lot more smart around this. You're not allowed to buy land in a lot of the countries that are buying our own land. That is wrong. Mr Speaker, the second point I would like to make is this is simply an interim measure. Personally, Mr. Speaker, I do have concerns around the fact that Fonterra is forced to sell part of its production to competitors. That does concern me. It's only 6%, but it's the principle. And that principle is, why should a company be forced to subsidise other companies? Like I said, it's only 6%, but it is the principle. But it brings us down to the price of milk. I, for one, am very pleased that the Commerce Commission has actually decided to reopen their investigation on the price of milk. Now, it may be their conclusion is everything's fine. Now, that's fine. But all New Zealanders want is a little bit of transparency. We want the knowledge that we are not being ripped off and rorted. Mr. Speaker, when I was young, I was a milk boy. I used to get up at 6 o'clock every morning and push a trolley around the street. And I used to drink milk by the pintful. When you get home, you'd scull a pint of milk. Before school, you'd scull a pint of milk. After rugby practice, you'd scull a pint of milk. We're a family of 4 children. Mum used to put out 6 milk bottles. Didn't cost her much at all. We used to have milk in schools. You probably wouldn't remember that, Mr. Speaker, but in the have milk in schools. Because they recognised that milk is a meal in a bottle. Milk is incredibly healthy. Milk is a necessity. It's not a luxury. But it has almost been priced at the luxury point. Coca-Cola is cheaper than milk. So something that is rotting the lives of our young people is cheaper than something that builds the lives. Somehow, we need to get back to the point where people choose milk over Coke. Wouldn't that be a great day? Because milk really is a very healthy food, and it is a necessity. And when we hear the stats, and Jonathan Coleman will know this, he's an ex-doctor, that New Zealand is the 3rd fattest country in the world, I've got to ask myself, what is going on here? Where have we fallen down so much that 1 in 4 of our children are starting school obese? That is a dreadful stat, and it's something we've got to do something about. It is the reason why Labor has decided to take GST off fresh fruit and vegetables, because we decided it was time to send a message that we value the health of this nation. Mr. Speaker, the other thing I would like to talk about is this appears to be an industry under threat. Now, why do I say that, you ask? Well, first of all, Fonterra, since the 31st of May 2007, has made $77.4 billion. But it's actually had tax credits of $23 million. It's had a profit before tax of $1.865 billion and a profit after tax of $1.888 billion. So on $77 billion worth of revenue, it's paid no tax whatsoever. And then according to IRD stats, there are around about 17,244 dairy farms at the moment, Mr. Speaker. But in 2009, they only paid $26 million in tax. That equates to $1,507 tax per dairy farm. Mr. Speaker, as mentioned, Fonterra is a vital part of our economy in terms of the export dollars it brings in, but we are getting absolutely no tax from this industry whatsoever. Fonterra's paid no tax since 2007. The dairy farmers have paid $26 million in tax. So this is an industry, obviously, if you look at the stats, that's struggling. Now, that goes against everything we know in terms of the price of milk. So I actually have some questions around how they are structuring their businesses that allows them to minimise their tax to such an extent that there's an average of $1,500 per dairy farmer, but that's an argument for another day. Mr. Speaker, just to close up, I would like to say there are 3 points I've made. Fonterra is vital to the New Zealand economy. This bill is simply an interim measure, until more can be done and more needs to be done. And the third point is the dairy industry appears to be an industry under threat. We do support this bill, Mr Speaker, but we do absolutely understand this is simply an interim measure. Thank you very much.
Joe Goodhue. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak very briefly on this dairy industry restructuring new sunset provision.